Wessex, under siege a prince, in the shadow of Viking terror. The 9th century in Britain was an age of unceasing terror defined by the relentless, brutal incursions of the Vikings. What had begun as seasonal raids escalated into a full-scale invasion, culminating in the arrival of the Great Heathen Army in 865 This vast host of Norse warriors, united under legendary figures like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, sought not just plunder but conquest and settlement, threatening to extinguish Anglo-Saxon England entirely. Amidst this existential crisis, Alfred, the youngest son of King Athelwulf of Wessex, was born around 849. Alfred's early life was unusual for an Anglo-Saxon prince. While his older brothers were being groomed for warfare and kingship, Alfred was sent to Rome twice at the age of 4 and again at 7, where he was reportedly confirmed by Pope Leo IV. These journeys to the heart of Christian Europe, undertaken amidst the pagan chaos engulfing his homeland, imbued him with a profound sense of religious devotion and exposed him to the sophisticated learning and governance of the Carolingian Empire. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Alfred learned to read and developed a lifelong passion for knowledge, a rarity for a warrior prince. His youth was overshadowed by a grim reality: the slow, agonizing collapse of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. By the time Alfred reached adulthood, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia, once proud and independent realms, had fallen there. Kings killed or subjugated their lands, ravaged, and their monasteries, centers of learning and wealth. Only Wessex, the southernmost kingdom, remained as the last bastion of Anglo-Saxon resistance, facing the full terrifying might of the Great Heathen Army. Alfred's path to the throne was not through primogeniture. He had 4 older brothers, all of whom ruled Wessex in quick succession, each battling the relentless Viking onslaught. Alfred served loyally under his brother King fighting alongside him in numerous, desperate battles against the Norsemen. He gained invaluable military experience, learning firsthand the brutal realities of Viking warfare and the limitations of conventional Anglo-Saxon tactics. The turning point came in 871, a year that became known as Alfred's Year of Battles. The Great Heathen Army, under the command of Halfdan and Bagseg, launched a full-scale invasion of Wessex. Alfred and Tetlard fought a series of desperate engagements, including the pivotal Battle of Ash. Here Alfred, leading a decisive counterattack on his own initiative, helped secure a rare Anglo-Saxon victory. However, the victory was costly and temporary. Later that year, Tetlard died, likely from wounds sustained in battle. At the tender age of 22, in the darkest hour of Anglo-Saxon England, Alfred inherited the throne of Wessex. The kingdom was on the verge of total collapse. Its armies exhausted, its people demoralized, and the Vikings camped on its very doorstep. His coronation was less a celebration and more a solemn, desperate acceptance of an overwhelming burden. The kingdom he inherited was not merely under threat, it was fighting for its very survival against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Alfred's immediate challenge was not just to rule, but to save England from utter annihilation. The lowest point in the rebirth at Athelney, 871 to 878, Alfred's initial years as king were marked not by victory, but by desperate compromise and retreat. He inherited a kingdom that was militarily exhausted and financially depleted. His first necessary action was the payment of the Danegeld, a heavy tribute paid to the Vikings to buy temporary peace. This controversial strategy was not a sign of weakness, but a calculated risk. Alfred needed time to reorganize his shattered forces. The Vikings accepted the gold and initially withdrew to settle lands outside Wessex, fulfilling their part of the truce. However, the respite was fragile, and Alfred knew the Norsemen were simply biding their time. The precarious peace was shattered in January 878. The Viking leader Guthrum orchestrated a massive surprise winter attack on Alfred's royal stronghold at Chippenham, in the heart of Wessex. The attack violated the holy truce of the Christmas season and was intended to decapitate the Anglo-Saxon command entirely. The shock was total. Alfred's court was overrun, and the king was forced to flee for his life, abandoning the capital and his royal dignity. This moment marked the absolute lowest point of Anglo-Saxon resistance. Alfred became a hunted fugitive, a king without a court, without an army, and seemingly without a future. he retreated into the deepest, remotest marshes and swamps of Athelney and Somerset. This area was an isolated island, accessible only by small boats, an impenetrable natural fortress where he and a handful of loyal followers could hide. It was here, according to enduring legend, that Alfred was forced to take refuge in a peasant's hut and was famously scolded for letting the cakes burn while contemplating the fate of his kingdom. The legend, though likely fictional, captures the true desperation of his situation. Alfred was reduced to nothing more than a desperate guerrilla leader. From his makeshift headquarters in Athelney, Alfred began the patient work of survival and revival. He spent several months conducting disciplined guerrilla warfare, small rapid attacks on Viking patrols to keep the spirit of resistance alive and harass Guthrum's supply lines. Crucially, he secretly sent messengers, the summons to the Fyrd, across the unconquered shires of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. These messages urged the loyal Anglo-Saxon militia, known as the Fyrd, to gather in secret. In the spring of 878, Alfred emerged from the shadows of the marshes. He rode out to a prearranged rendezvous point known as Egbert's Stone, a historically verifiable gathering place. Here the remaining Fyrd loyalists who had risked everything to answer his secret call assembled. The sight of their young king alive and ready to fight galvanized the morale of the Anglo-Saxons. Alfred was no longer a fugitive. He was a commander leading a resurrected army. The stage was set for the decisive confrontation. That would determine whether the name England would survive or be forever extinguished by the Viking tide. The Battle of Edington and the Treaty of Wedmore, 878 AD. Emerging from the depths of Athelney, Alfred had successfully mobilized the fragmented forces of Wessex. He led his newly gathered army with grim determination and renewed confidence, marching swiftly toward the location of Guthrum's main Viking encampment near Chippenham. The decisive clash occurred in May 878 at the Battle of Edington in Wiltshire. This battle was the ultimate test for the survival of the entire Anglo-Saxon civilization. It was a pivotal moment in the history of Britain that would determine the fate of the island for centuries to come. Alfred's army, though perhaps smaller and less experienced than the seasoned Viking horde, was highly motivated and fought fiercely on their own sacred land with the desperate courage of those defending their homes and families. Alfred utilized the strong traditional Anglo-Saxon tactic of the shield wall, a disciplined defensive formation that proved exceptionally effective against the less coordinated but ferociously charged assaults of the Viking warriors. The engagement raged 4 hours across the battlefield. It was a brutal, grinding confrontation between two deeply opposed civilizations, one fighting desperately for its very existence, and the other striving for plunder, settlement, and new territory. The Wessex forces held their lines with remarkable tenacity and slowly but surely began to push the Viking ranks backward, successfully forcing them into confusion and fatal disorder. The Anglo-Saxons achieved a decisive tactical breakthrough, shattering the Viking morale and completely routing the fearsome Great Heathen Army. Guthrum's forces were utterly defeated. Their organized military power was comprehensively broken by Alfred's tactical brilliance and the fierce loyalty of his soldiers. The remnants of the Viking army fled in disarray, retreating to their fortified camp located at Alfred immediately pursued the defeated enemy, initiating a relentless siege of the Viking stronghold. The siege lasted for 14 protracted days. Inside the Burh fort, the Vikings, who were generally unaccustomed to the rigors of prolonged defensive siege warfare and lacked proper long-term provisions, quickly ran out of food, water, and morale. Faced with the twin prospects of mass starvation or total annihilation, Guthrum was compelled to negotiate an unconditional surrender. Alfred's demands were profoundly innovative. They transcended a mere military exchange and were fundamentally political, cultural, and spiritual in nature. The centerpiece of the surrender was the Treaty of Wedmore, which secured a definitive end to the immediate Viking threat by demanding that Guthrum and his elite commanders submit to Christian baptism. This requirement was Alfred's greatest stroke of political genius, effectively transforming a mortal military enemy into a spiritual vassal and potential ally bound by a solemn, sacred oath. Guthrum accepted the profound terms. 3 weeks later, the formidable Viking leader was formally baptized at Alfred's court, in a ceremony designed to maximize symbolic importance and public exposure. Alfred himself stood as Guthrum's godfather, bestowing upon the former Viking warlord the Christian name Athelney. This baptism was the ultimate symbolic and legal act. It bound Guthrum to Alfred, not just by treaty obligations, but by the most sacred oaths recognized throughout the entire Christian world, making future justified invasions on the basis of religious conflict impossible. The Treaty of Wedmore also established a formal and lasting geopolitical peace by officially dividing England according to strict geographical boundaries. A specific political border was drawn, running roughly from London northwards along the River Thames, and then following a delineated line towards the abandoned Roman city of Chester. The entire landmass to the south and west of this line remained Wessex, securing Alfred's undisputed control over the last remaining free Anglo-Saxon territory. The land to the north and east was officially ceded and granted as settlement territory to the Viking settlers. This vast territory became known to history as the Danelaw, a region where Danish law held sway over Anglo-Saxon law. This division formalized the definitive end of major Viking expansion into the core of Anglo-Saxon lands. And most importantly, it provided Alfred with the necessary stability and peace to finally focus on rebuilding his shattered kingdom, laying the permanent groundwork for what would eventually become a unified English national identity. The architect of defense, Burhs, the Fyrd, and the Navy, 878 to 886. The Treaty of Wedmore bought Alfred peace, but he understood implicitly that the treaty was only as strong as the defenses of Wessex. He recognized that the defeats suffered by the Anglo-Saxons were not due to a lack of courage, but to fundamental failures in military organization and infrastructure. The existing system, based on calling up the traditional militia, was ineffective because the entire agricultural workforce had to leave their fields, creating a devastating choice between starvation and invasion. Alfred resolved that Wessex would never again be caught vulnerable by a surprise Viking raid. He instituted a comprehensive, revolutionary program of institutional reform. The centerpiece of this great project was the construction of the Burghal system, a network of interconnected, permanent fortified towns known as Burhs. These burghs were strategically placed throughout Wessex, ensuring that no subject of the king was more than a day's ride from the safety of a fortified wall. They served a dual purpose. They were military garrisons and defensive refuges, but they were also designed to act as economic and administrative centers. This planned urbanization revitalized trade and created stable, secure markets, which directly financed their own defense. The detailed construction and maintenance requirements of this system were recorded in the Burghal Hit, a remarkable administrative document that precisely quantified the tax base and manpower needed for each burgh's defense. This document demonstrates Alfred's unparalleled organizational genius, as it provided a stable, quantifiable, and sustainable solution to Viking raiding. Simultaneously, Alfred fundamentally reformed the structure and deployment of the Fyrd. He ended the practice of calling up the entire militia force at once, a system that invariably led to crop failures and famine. He instituted a rotational system where the Fyrd was divided into two halves. One half was continuously in arms and on active duty, manning the Burhs and ready for battle, while the other half remained at home to manage the essential farming and production. This rotational military service ensured that the kingdom maintained a professional, well-trained standing army year-round, while preserving the critical agricultural economy by solving the historical conflict between food security and military readiness. Alfred stabilized his kingdom's finances and its morale. Alfred also made a revolutionary move by recognizing that the key to security lay not just on land, but at sea. He understood that the Vikings always retained the initiative, because they controlled the coastal waters and could land anywhere at will. He therefore established the first sustained, state-sponsored English navy. Alfred personally oversaw the construction of a new fleet of longships, specifically designed to counter the Danish vessels. These Wessex ships were often reported to be larger and faster than the Danish longship, designed not only for speed, but for stability and fighting efficiency, showcasing his remarkable technological foresight. This nascent navy was not always successful, but it began the tradition of English maritime power, directly challenging the Vikings' previous uncontested dominance of the surrounding seas. The success of these reforms culminated in the pivotal event of 886 AD, the recapture of London. London, though heavily damaged, was strategically vital. Located on the border between Wessex and the Danube, Alfred's forces successfully drove out the Viking elements and occupied the city, initiating its comprehensive refurbishment and refortification as a new burh. This single act had massive symbolic significance. It was viewed by all remaining Anglo-Saxons as a sign that Alfred was the rightful, dominant ruler not just of Wessex, but of all non-Viking England. The chroniclers of the time began to refer to him not merely as the King of Wessex, but as the King of the Anglo-Saxons, formally marking his rise from fugitive to the acknowledged leader of a new, unified political entity. The scholar, king, law, learning, and the forging of identity. 886 ADC. 892. 8. With the Viking threat contained by the Burghal system and the Fyrd reforms, Alfred turned his formidable energy toward internal governance, recognizing that a kingdom is defined not only by its walls, but by its laws and its knowledge. He believed the Viking scourge was partially a divine punishment for the Anglo-Saxons' moral and educational decline. Therefore, true stability required a moral and intellectual renaissance. Alfred's first focus was the establishment of a cohesive and just legal system to bind his newly secured territories. Around 892, he commissioned the creation of the Domboc Book of Laws, a compilation and codification of existing legal customs. This code was not a sudden invention of new laws, but a brilliant fusion of the best laws from his predecessors, such as the laws of King Ina of Wessex and King Offa of Mercia, demonstrating a commitment to legal continuity across the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Crucially, Alfred prefaced the Domboc with the Ten Commandments and excerpts from Mosaic law, firmly placing the foundation of his secular law within a Christian moral framework. The core principle of the Domboc was the pursuit of fairness and the clear application of justice, with a strong emphasis on establishing fair compensatory fines to reduce the need for feuds and blood vengeance. By presenting a unified legal code, Alfred laid the essential groundwork for a single, unified English legal identity that transcended the old borders of Wessex and Mercia. Alfred's most enduring legacy, the one that truly earned him the epithet the Great, was his revolutionary revival of learning. He lamented that when he came to the throne, literacy in Latin, the language of governance, theology, and high culture, was virtually non-existent, even among the clergy. He famously declared that there were very few priests south of the Thames who could understand their own services in Latin. Alfred therefore launched a monumental, state-sponsored translation project, recognizing that the common people and the clergy needed access to fundamental knowledge in their native tongue. He gathered a team of scholars from across Britain and the continent to translate the essential works of antiquity and early Christianity from Latin into Old English. Alfred often personally supervised and even participated in the labor-intensive translation process himself, ensuring linguistic quality and accessibility. Key works translated under his direction included Pope Gregory I's seminal manual for bishops, Pastoral Care, which became required reading for his clergy. He also translated Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy and Works by Augustine of Hippo and the historian Bede. By translating these complex works into the West Saxon dialect of Old English, Alfred effectively standardized the written language and made sophisticated knowledge available to a much wider audience, single-handedly preventing the collapse of Anglo-Saxon intellectual tradition. In parallel with his translation efforts, Alfred commissioned the compilation of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a comprehensive and continuous historical record This chronicle charted the struggles and triumphs of the Anglo-Saxon people against the Viking invaders and the political events leading up to Alfred's reign. The chronicle was not just history. It was a powerful piece of nation-building propaganda, articulating a shared narrative that bound the inhabitants of Wessex and Mercia together as the English people by promoting law, fostering intellectual growth, and creating a shared historical identity. Alfred cemented the peace he had won on the battlefield, transforming a collection of battered kingdoms into a unified, enduring political and cultural entity capable of surviving future Viking storms. The final storm and the test of the Burhs, 892 to 896 AD. The peace established by the Treaty of Wedmore proved temporary, but the reforms it enabled were permanent. In 892 AD, Alfred faced the ultimate test of his systems with the arrival of a massive new Viking force, potentially the largest organized invasion since the original Great Heathen Army. This new force, led by the veteran warlord Heiston, landed on the coast of Kent, bringing with them a fleet of hundreds of ships and a vast, seasoned fighting force ready for conquest. Heiston's arrival instantly plunged Wessex into a desperate 4-year conflict, known historically as the 4 Years' War. However, unlike the invasion of 878 AD, this time the Viking commanders discovered a fundamentally different and far more challenging England. This invasion became the definitive trial of the Burghal system. The Vikings, accustomed to relying on swift movements and surprise to overrun defenseless towns, found that their traditional tactics were fatally ineffective. Every strategic target they approached was now a well-garrisoned burh, forcing the invaders to engage in difficult, prolonged siege warfare which they were poorly equipped to sustain. The Viking army attempted to build their own strongholds, such as the one at but Alfred's disciplined forces, operating from the safety of the Burhs, immediately besieged and destroyed them, capturing their plunder, ships, and families. Alfred's strategy throughout the 4 years was one of patient containment and disciplined. He refused to engage the Vikings in large, high-risk open battles unless absolutely necessary. Instead, his forces shadowed the Viking movements, using the fortified network to cut off supplies and deny the invaders a secure foothold or a successful retreat route. The recently reformed Fyrd proved its worth, operating flawlessly under the rotational system. When Alfred required an army to deal with the siege or pursuit, he could call upon a reliable, well-trained half of the militia, while the other half remained at home, ensuring that the necessary agricultural work continued and the kingdom did not starve. This institutional endurance was the Vikings' undoing. Alfred's nascent navy also played a critical role in the final years of the conflict. Alfred commanded his ships to block the River Lee, effectively trapping a large part of the Viking fleet that had sailed up the river, denying them their escape route back to the sea. The trapped Vikings were forced to abandon their ships and retreat overland towards the realizing the true nature of their defeat. By 896 AD, the long, grueling war was over. The Viking invasion failed, not due to a single miraculous battle, but because Alfred's comprehensive and interconnected system Burhs, the reformed Fyrd, and the nascent navy made the cost of staying in Wessex prohibitively high. The exhausted invaders ultimately disbanded. Some scattered to the settled Vikings of the Danelaw, while others sailed back to the continent, utterly convinced that the English kingdom they had once easily broken was now too resilient to conquer. This victory marked the definitive end of major Viking military threats to the Anglo-Saxon heartland during Alfred's lifetime, cementing the permanence of his reforms and securing the land he had risked everything to save. The sunset of the reign and the enduring legacy, 896 to 899 AD and beyond, with the defeat and withdrawal of Heiston's massive army in 896 AD. The last great organized Viking threat to Wessex ended during Alfred's lifetime. The final years of his reign were dedicated entirely to consolidation, administration, and continuing the intellectual revival he had so passionately championed. He ensured the final versions of his translated works were copied and distributed, cementing the foundational texts of the nascent English culture. he continued to oversee the meticulous maintenance of the Burh network, recognizing that perpetual vigilance was the only guarantee of peace. However, Alfred's life of ceaseless military command and intellectual labor, often conducted amidst immense physical suffering, began to take its final toll. The great king had struggled throughout his adult life with a debilitating, painful chronic illness, which historians today speculate may have been a form of Crohn's disease or a similar internal affliction. This constant, unseen battle with pain makes his extraordinary achievements all the more remarkable. Knowing his time was limited, Alfred meticulously managed the political transition to ensure the stability and continuity that had been absent in the reigns of his brothers. He had carefully groomed his son, Edward the Elder, for leadership, ensuring he was ready to inherit the complex kingdom Alfred had forged. Alfred also arranged a pivotal strategic marriage for his highly capable daughter, Hilthelfeld, who married Tellard, the alderman of Mercia. This alliance secured Mercian loyalty, and following her husband's death, Hilthelfeld felt herself would rise to become the legendary Lady of the Merchant, proving to be one of the most formidable military and political leaders of the next generation, a direct testament to Alfred's wisdom in nurturing talent. On October 26, 899 AD, Alfred the Great died, likely in his late 40s, exhausted by decades of perpetual warfare, governance, and illness. His death marked not a collapse, but a remarkably smooth transition of power to his designated heir, Edward, proving that Alfred had successfully created a stable, institutional monarchy capable of surviving the death of its founder. Alfred's historical legacy is profound and multifaceted, truly earning him the unique epithet, the Great. On the military front, he did not just win battles. He solved the strategic problem of defense forever by institutionalizing the Burghal system, creating the infrastructure necessary to repel invaders without collapsing the economy. In the political realm, he consciously transcended the narrow kingship of Wessex, becoming the recognized leader of all Anglo-Saxons. An essential step toward the creation of the unitary Kingdom of England by his grandson in law and governance. The Domboc established a foundational, unified legal code based on justice and Christian morality, which would serve as the basis for English common law for centuries. And perhaps most enduringly, in the cultural sphere, Alfred saved the language and literacy of his people by personally championing the translation of essential Latin works into Old English and initiating the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. He preserved and standardized the English language, creating the indispensable literary foundation for the nation. He was a warrior who understood that peace was won not just with the sword, but with the pen, the wall, and the law. Alfred's contemporaries did not call him the Great. This title was bestowed by later chroniclers, who, looking back across the centuries, realized that the man who had been a hunted fugitive in 878 AD was in fact the essential founder, the true architect of the English nation.